Welcome to this explainer. Okay, I want you to imagine for a second that your brain isn't just this mysterious, squishy biological organ. Instead, think of it as a highly complex machine. Now, imagine this machine has spent years receiving very specific chemical inputs, and to survive, it's actually completely rewired its own hardware. So, when you decide you want to change or stop those inputs, you can't just flip a switch and expect the whole system to instantly go back to normal, right? It literally requires a structural reboot. The source material we're diving into today is incredibly fascinating because it looks at psychiatric withdrawal not as just some passive medical treatment, but as a hardcore advanced engineering problem. So, this radical manual completely reframes the central nervous system as wetware. The brain is broken down into these distinct modular components, kind of like a computer. You've got your prefrontal cortex interface, your thalamic integration matrix, the whole shebang. The core argument here is that simply stopping a medication just doesn't work. Why? Because the machinery itself has physically adapted to run on it. To escape this chemical reliance, you need what the manual calls therapeutic bricolage. It's the super deliberate, multi-layered engineering approach where you are actively rebuilding the brain's networks piece by piece.
To really wrap our heads around how this works, we're going to walk through the 6 phases of this blueprint. We've got 1. The psychiatric trap. 2. Unmasking bin syndrome. 3. The 4-brick architecture. 4. Hardware and wetware hacks. 5. The dark social shield. And finally, 6. Neuroadaptive remodeling. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The psychiatric trap, or escaping the iatrogenic loop. Right off the bat, the sources diagnose a massive systemic failure in traditional medicine. They call it an iatrogenic loop, which is a fancy way of saying the treatment itself is actually what's causing the illness. Crazy, right? The text starkly contrasts two completely different mindsets. You've got the old paradigm, which is basically blind compliance and institutional dependence. You know the drill. You get a prescription, you follow it, you suffer side effects, and eventually you end up dependent. But the new paradigm? That is all about agency. It's an absolute game changer. It demands that you shift from being a passive patient to becoming an active engineer who takes total control of their own architectural reconstruction.
It's a massive shift. You're moving away from that rigid, downward cycle of just blindly following orders and stepping into a highly dynamic, proactive state. It's no longer about just doing what you're told. It's about utilizing real pharmacokinetic math, literally calculating exactly how a drug moves through your body, and combining that with advanced tech and even underground networks to rebuild your central nervous system.
Now, you might be wondering, why is this drastic shift even necessary? Well, it comes down to something called the iatrogenic double hit. The sources explain how a quarter century of chemical modifications literally forces the brain into this biological survival hack. For example, if someone uses medications that target GABA receptors, like alprazolam, for a long time, it causes downregulation. What that means is the brain actually destroys its own natural calming brakes because, well, the drug is doing all the work for it. So the big takeaway here is that your brain structure has physically changed. Section 2. Unmasking bind syndrome and the illusion of relapse. This is absolutely crucial because traditional medicine frequently misdiagnoses this profound invisible damage as just a return of the original anxiety. The core concept we need to understand is bind syndrome, benzodiazepine-induced neurological dysfunction. Let's make sure we're super clear on what this is. Bind means there is physical, structural damage to the brain's receptors. Actually, scratch the idea of a psychological relapse entirely, because it's not that. Merely removing the drug, it doesn't do a thing to heal a system that has already dismantled its own internal calming factories. Think about a perfectly healthy synapse. It has these really strong anchors keeping the GABA receptors perfectly in place. But with bind syndrome, it's like a construction site gone wrong. The receptors have literally migrated completely outside the synapse, and the anchors keeping them there are broken. This structural dismantling is exactly what creates that long-term cognitive fog and hyper-excitability people experience. And here is the tragedy. Doctors often mistake this structural instability for a psychiatric relapse and just put patients right back on the drugs. Section 3. The 4-brick architecture, your roadmap to reconstruction. So now that we've diagnosed the actual structural damage, how do we fix it? The source material outlines a very specific toolkit for repair, breaking it down into 4 modular intervention bricks. Brick 1 is pharmacokinetics, which is basically your engine. Brick 2 is neurotechnology, your hardware. Brick 3 is biohacking, your wetware. And brick 4 is the dark social ecosystem, which acts as your network. Let's walk through this blueprint. Diving straight into brick 1, we have to bust the myth of cold turkey. Stopping a medication abruptly is not some test of willpower. In reality, it triggers a catastrophic systemic failure in the brain. It causes what's called glutamatergic hyperexcitability. Think of it as a massive, severe electrical storm inside your head, triggered because an abrupt or even just a linear withdrawal forces the whole nervous system to crash. It literally shatters the system. To prevent that electrical storm, we have to rely on math. There's this principle called the law of mass action, and it proves that receptor occupancy by these drugs is not linear. At lower doses, making even tiny reductions frees up a massive amount of receptors all at once. That is exactly why traditional linear tapering fails so spectacularly at the very end. To prevent a complete cataclysmic crash, hyperbolic tapering is absolutely essential. That means making smaller and smaller reductions based on whatever dose is actually remaining. And the mathematical rule here, which is backed by recent guidelines, is shockingly precise. We are talking about a reduction of only 5 to 10% of the remaining dose every few weeks. To put that into perspective, we are talking about microscopic, highly calculated scalebacks. But let's be real, trying to do that intense math at home with a scale and a scalpel, that is incredibly stressful and risky. That's why the blueprint highlights brilliant innovations like Dutch tapering strips. These things completely automate the math. They deliver daily pouches with the exact, hyperbolically decreasing microdoses already measured out. It takes an immense logistical burden right off the patient's shoulders, letting them taper safely without the constant fear of human error. Section 4. Hardware and wetware hacks. Forcing neuroplasticity. Okay, let's talk about the hardware front. First up, we've got transcranial magnetic stimulation, or RTMS. This uses intense magnetic fields to literally hack your brain's electromagnetic networks, modulating the prefrontal cortex to help restore normal connectivity. Then, running alongside that, you have the stellate ganglion block, or SGB. This is an injection that physically cuts off the hyperarousal fight or flight signal that's constantly being sent to the brain. It's basically an immediate autonomous reboot of the body's alert system. Shifting internally to the wetware, we look at hyperbaric oxygen therapy. This floods the brain with oxygen to fight off inflammation. Combine that with fasting-induced autophagy, which actually forces your body to recycle defective cellular materials. It's like a deep clean for your cells. And to complement all of this, the manual suggests advanced nutritional support. We're talking targeted botanicals like lion's mane to stimulate nerve growth factor, alongside NAD+ IV therapies to restore mitochondrial energy that's been depleted by years and years of altered metabolism. Section 5. The Dark Social Shield. Pirating information distribution. Here's where it gets wild. When institutional medicine fails by proposing abrupt withdrawal, a patient's survival absolutely depends on underground peer-to-peer networks. I know, it sounds straight out of sci-fi novel, but this is happening right now. The blueprint details the fascinating use of autonomous AI agents that actually infiltrate social platforms like Reddit and WhatsApp. These bots detect distress signals from users experiencing dangerous withdrawals, and they surgically inject precise survival protocols, like those hyperbolic tapering guides we talked about, exactly where and when they are needed most. It is literally an algorithmic rescue mission. Section 6. Neuroadaptive Remodeling and the Synergy Matrix. So, let's bring it all together with the therapeutic bricolage matrix. This perfectly summarizes how everything we just talked about has to work together. You've got the foundation, which is the chemical tapering, the spark, the hardware tech, the mortar, which is the wetware nutrition, and finally, the shield, the dark social network. All of these must operate in absolute synergy. The source material couldn't be clearer on this. No single brick works in isolation to pull off this escape. You literally need the whole matrix. And all of this culminates in a really powerful scientific reality. Passing from dependency to freedom is not about taking a step backward to who you used to be. You do not just magically regain your original 100% plasticity. Instead, it's like building a resilient bridge. This radical bricolage process helps you forge a brand newly remodeled, highly stable, and incredibly resilient biological system. Which leaves us with this deeply empowering and honestly provocative thought from the text. You don't go back to who you were. You become the architect of your own reconquest. So it makes you wonder, how might you rethink your own approach to the complex, systemic challenges in your life? Are you just passively waiting around for a fix, or are you ready to roll up your sleeves and become the engineer? I highly encourage you to dive into the source material to explore these protocols even deeper. Thanks so much for exploring this incredible roadmap with us today.